Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Bible study in Philippians. We're in Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 through 18 today. And here are our verses. What we're going to see is the Apostle Paul is going to tell us how to have the right mindset. It's a mindset of joy and rejoicing. And he's going to introduce us to something here today that is very important. How do we react when we are treated inappropriately, when we are treated wrongly? And this is something that's been going on here in the church. He's been talking about how his chains have not stopped the gospel from being spread, and that because of his imprisonment, there are many who are out preaching Jesus. And now he says this, he says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether in false motives or true, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice. So we see his mindset here. He's going to rejoice, and he's talking about two different groups of people here. They're both preaching about Jesus, and he says some are doing it out of envy and out of rivalry. And he says they're also doing it out of selfish ambition, not sincerely. He says they have false motives in what they're doing. So this is one group. This is a group that they want to cause Paul trouble. As a matter of fact, he says they do this supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. I mean, what an amazing thing that this group would be trying to cause Paul more anguish. Paul's been in prison for well over 2 years at this point. He has suffered through a lot of things. And to imagine that there would be a group of Christian leaders who are preaching about Jesus, who want to stir up more trouble for the Apostle Paul, is unimaginable. These are men of God. And even in the first century, we see that there is this envy, there is this rivalry, there's jealousy. All of these things are taking place. And what we see here with the Apostle Paul is there's another group. He says, but there are others who preach Christ out of goodwill and out of love. And he says they are preaching Christ here out of motives that are true. So we see another group that they're a blessing to the Apostle Paul, and their motives are completely true in this. He says, it doesn't matter. In either way, I am going to rejoice because of one thing. And he says, that is, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that in every way, whether in false motives or true, Christ is preached. And that was the joy of the Apostle Paul, that Jesus was first. And the Apostle Paul said there are other people here, and they're preaching about Jesus, and I am not going to try to put myself above them. I am going to be a servant. I am going to be last. I'm going to put others above myself. I have Jesus. I have others. I have myself or yourself. And this is what the mindset of the Apostle Paul is. And whenever we put Jesus first and we put others second, even if they are even if they're causing and stirring up trouble for us, even if their motives are not true, even if they are doing things out of selfish ambition, not out of goodwill, even if there are problems, Paul says, I am going to take the high road and I am going to be a servant of all. And that is going to become a major theme in this letter. It is the letter of joy and rejoicing. And if you want to have joy and you want to rejoice, you put Jesus first, you put others second, you put yourself last, and you're going to find that you're going to have a joyful, rejoicing life. There was a man that we met, that the Apostle Paul would talk about when he wrote his letter to Timothy. This would be after his letter to the Philippians, but his name was Onesiphorus, and he was a wonderful man of God who, Paul says, he often refreshed me when I was in my chains. So the Apostle Paul was in chains when he wrote the book of Philippians. He would be released only to be rearrested later for preaching the gospel, and there he would be in his final stay in prison, because this would be when Nero would put him to death after this stay. So this is a few years after his letter to the Philippians. But he says this, he says, may the Lord show to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. On the contrary, when he was in Rome, and that's where Paul was in prison, he says he searched hard for me until he found me. May the Lord grant that he will find mercy from the Lord on that day. And the day that he's talking about is the day when we stand before Jesus and receive the blessings for the things that we've done in the flesh. And Paul is praying one day when he stands before Jesus, I pray that he will be given reward for the things that he's done for me. You know very well how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. We also see a man by the name of Diotrephes, and this is the Apostle John when he writes in 3 John, in verse 9 there. He writes about a man here, Diotrephes, who he says he's obviously a leader in the church, and he says he loves to be first. He will not welcome us. So apparently the Apostle John desired to visit a certain congregation, and the pastor of the church, or the leader of the church, Diotrephes, he would not welcome him. And he would not welcome those who were with John. Because he loves to be first. He loves to have this place of preeminence. And with John being an apostle, John would have taken the attention off of Diotrephes. So what we see are two different kinds of people here. We see those who were not self-seeking, those who were not self-ambitious, those who were not envious of others who were in the church. But we also see people that the Apostle Paul was speaking of there in Philippi who were that way, and whom John speaks about here, Diotrephes, who wanted to be first, who loved that position of being in the front, loved to be in the position of the leader, and he would not welcome the Apostle John. So two different types of people. We see that throughout the church from the first century until now, that there are those who love these positions of power, and they are ambitious for self. But truly, this is what, and we read about in Galatians. The Apostle Paul says this. He says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live the grace of Christ. He says, and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. He said, when I was with you, Galatians, I spoke to you about the true gospel, that Jesus died for your sins, that he rose again, and that if you put your trust in him, your faith in him, that by grace you can be saved. That's the true gospel. It's not about what you can do, it's about what Jesus has done. And he says to this group, he says, now you're turning away from that. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. So there were apparently some who were there in the church at Galatia, and they were saying, you have to do something. You have to add to the grace of Christ. It's not enough that Jesus just died on the cross and now you put your trust in him and believe. You have to do something. It's about grace and works. He says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preached to you, the gospel of grace, let them be under God's curse. Paul is very strong here against this group of preachers who are preaching a different gospel. He says, as we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Now, why is Paul so powerful in this passage speaking against this group of preachers? But when he is there in his letter to the Philippians, he says, these men are doing these things, and he says, it doesn't matter as long as Christ is being preached. The reason is this. Those in Galatia are preaching a gospel that has to do with works. They're not preaching the true gospel. The true gospel is that Jesus did it all for us. We are saved by grace through faith, and it's not of ourselves. It is a gift of God. So these men in Galatia Paul is firm against them because the gospel that they're preaching is not the gospel at all. But in Philippi, even though these men were ambitious for self, even though they were envious of Paul's position, even though they wanted to cause Paul problems, they were still preaching the true gospel, that you are saved by grace. So Paul says, it doesn't matter to me. I am going to put myself in a position of being a servant, and as long as they want to preach Jesus and preach the true gospel, then that's fine. So we have two different types of people here that the Apostle Paul is addressing. He would say in Philippians chapter 2, now just to kind of carry that thought on, that it's Jesus first, it's others second, and then putting yourself last. He says in Philippians 2, do nothing out of selfish ambition. These pastors were preaching Jesus out of selfish ambition. He tells the Christians there, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, and that's what Paul is showing them here. He's saying, I'm going to be humble here. I'm going to put myself beneath all of this. And I'm not going to make it an issue. He says, in humility, value others above yourself. So Jesus, others, yourself. That's the joy that we have in the Lord. Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Even though these men are being selfish, and even though they have this selfish ambition, even though they have the vain conceit, he says, I'm going to look out for the interests of others. He says, you Christians there in Philippi, you do the same thing. You know, whenever you place yourself above all of this, if it's in the church, or if it's in your home, or if it's in your workplace, then you're going to run into problems. In Philippians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul gives another example. He says, this is what I want you Philippians to do. But I want to give the example of a young man by the name of Timothy. Timothy again, the one who was with the Apostle Paul on his missionary journeys, the one who looked to Paul as his father in the faith. He says, I hope in the Lord to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks out for their own interests. So he says there's a lot of people out there who are just vain. They have their own self-ambition, but not Timothy. Timothy is genuine. He's not concerned about his own interests. He is concerned about the interests of Jesus. Timothy is this very unique individual, a true leader in the church. But you know that Timothy has proved himself because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. This is Timothy. So Paul begins to lay out how we can have true joy by putting Jesus first, the way Paul does, the way Timothy does. And he says, you follow after my example. Follow after the example of Timothy. And then he actually says, you want to have this mindset, and it's the mindset of Jesus. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Now, what would that mindset look like? Now, he talks about Jesus, who being in very nature God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John would say, Jesus is in very nature God. Now, what did Jesus do? Even though he is God in the flesh, he is Emmanuel, he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He put his nature aside, took on flesh so that he could come and die for us upon the cross, and so that our sins could be forgiven. So he is in very nature God, but he sets aside his godhood. And he says, rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. This is the mindset of Jesus. So Paul says, in your relationships with one another, you have the same mindset. You're going to put Jesus first. You're going to put others second. You're going to put yourself in that position of having nothing, of being a servant. It's what God did. It's what he has called us to. And if we will do that, putting Jesus first, others second, and ourselves third, then we are going to have the same joy that the Apostle Paul was able to experience, even though he was in prison, even though he couldn't do the things he wanted to do. He wasn't free to be able to carry the gospel into other places. And even though there were those who were still attacking him, even though he was in this prison situation, Paul says, joy, rejoice, I have this mindset. The mindset of Jesus, you remember in John chapter 13, the disciples had been arguing about who was going to be first in the kingdom. They knew that Jesus was about ready to set up a brand new kingdom, and they were arguing with each other about who was going to be in those positions of authority. And Jesus hears this, and he goes to the place. Now we're at the Last Supper, and we're just a few hours away from his arrest and his crucifixion, but he does this one last thing so that they will understand truly what their position is to be. He goes around, he washes their feet. This is something that a servant would do. And here you have God incarnate, and he's washing their feet, their dirty feet. And it says, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set an example that you should do as I have done for you. He's saying, I want you to be a servant. It's not about who's going to rise to these great positions of authority within the kingdom. He said, your authority is in being a servant. As I came to serve, and I'm giving you this example, I came to serve. You now are to be a servant of others. Jesus, he gave us the example. And now he says, this is my desire for your life. In the book of James, James would write this. He says, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. It's exactly the words that the Apostle Paul used when he was writing to the Philippians there, the passage we read. He says, there are those who are preaching out of selfish ambition. They have envy. And he says, James says, when you find these things, you're going to find disorder. You're going to find evil practice. And even though these are men who are preaching the true gospel, they're bringing in disorder within to the church. And wherever you find these things, this ambition that is all about self, and you're going to find disorder within the church. And Jesus says, or James says here, speaking for the Lord, he says, this shouldn't be. This is going to bring about evil. Paul would say to the Corinthians, no one should seek their own good, but seek the good of others. That's where we need to be. It's putting others before us, before ourselves. And then finally, one more verse I'd like to share. It says the most important one. Jesus now he's talking about, someone has asked him, Lord, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says the most important one is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. It's loving your neighbor. Whatever they might do, you love your neighbor. As a matter of fact, remember what Jesus says. Love your enemies. Love those who persecute you. Even if they're not a friendly neighbor, you love your enemies. And you put God first. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's Jesus, others, yourself. And that's what the message is when we get here to this wonderful letter Paul writes to the Philippians. It's this letter of joy. It's the letter of rejoicing. And he's saying, this is how you do it. Jesus, others, yourself. A couple of questions for us to consider here. How does Paul judge whether a situation is good or bad? And you can go back to chapter 1 and verse 18, and you can rediscover that question and the answer for that question. Number 2, how do we usually judge whether something is good or bad? And that'll give you some thought there. When bad things happen to us, how can we maintain a healthy perspective? How did Paul do this? How was he able to maintain a healthy outlook on everything? Number 4, what situation would cause people to preach Christ out of envy or selfish ambition? And number 5, have you been critical of motives or methods of other Christians who are accurately preaching the gospel? Go ahead and think that over. So here are some questions for you, and certainly some very thought-provoking verses that the Apostle Paul gives us here. God bless you.